Brian Astbury, the space, take one.
Okay.
Hang on.
Oh, sorry.
You just let me know when you're good to go, and then you just go, right, okay, so here we go.
Here we go, Brian.
Hang on.
Simple. It depended who you were. If you were white South African, you really didn't notice it very much. If you were black South African, it was part of your daily life. Everything was about apartheid if you were black. Whites lived in comfort. You know, I remember my childhood as a really happy time with nothing really getting in the way of it. And we had black servants and coloured servants, and that was the order of things. And it was only when I got out of my hometown and went into the university and suddenly started coming up against more radical people and more radical ideas that I started questioning it. I started questioning it quite early one day, going home from school with my best friend, and we suddenly heard this hell of a commotion over the wall of this farmhouse in Paarl in South Africa, and looked over, and there was a bunch of policemen who were throwing one of the workers on the farm into a police wagon. And they were just handling them so badly that both my friend and I, on the way home, we were outraged at how they had. But there was nothing you could do, and it didn't keep going. And that was one of the first, adventures with apartheid. But for the rest, it really didn't come in the way, for white South Africans. It was a fact of life which you lived with. Well, it was a sort of cumulative thing. When I was about 5, I think, I don't remember, where I was walking up the road with my father. And I belonged in that way that children do to the gang in my street. There were about 6 or 7 of us, most boys. And we'd rush around and you pick up things from them. And we were walking up the road and we passed this black man, and I can't remember why or what, but I called him a kafir, which is the worst thing that you could say. And my father stopped me in the road, called the man over and made me apologize to him, and said to him, "You never do that again," and I didn't. So that was my first real experience of apartheid. And then, as I said, there were the policemen throwing the guy in prison, and then slowly you started getting more and more involved with it. University really upped that, and at the same time, I'd met Yvonne. And Yvonne had a lot of coloured and black friends. She wrote ghosted a column for Drum magazine, which was, the black magazine that was very radical in that period of time. And I then got thrown in at the deep end of apartheid in Cape Town. I was brought up in Paarl in South Africa. It's a small town about 30 miles outside of Cape Town. It's an absolutely beautiful town in a valley, surrounded by large mountains on the one side and a smaller mountain with a famous Paarl Rock. It's a huge granite outcrop. Those days it used to be covered in pines, and the valley was filled with oak trees and vineyards. And they've actually maintained the whole high street, which is one of the longest high streets in South Africa. It goes on for 8 miles. Half of it is still with the buildings that were built there originally, and it's amazing when you go down it. It's just like it was when I was a boy. And I was brought up in this sort of, rather idyllic town, which I loved, I had a river to play and I had a mountain to climb. I had foofy slides. You know what a foofy slide is on the mountain amidst the things. There was a dam up on the mountain that we could swim in. It was just extraordinary, beautiful town to be born in. And it happened also to be the birthplace of Afrikaans, the Afrikaans language. It was in Paarl, and I went to an Afrikaans school where we had an English, it was dual medium, so we had an English group, but you got a lot of your education in Afrikaans. Some classes were in English, and And so I didn't have a thing that I found when I went to Cape Town, which was a very anti-Afrikaans thing in the English groups in Cape Town. Actually, now I've got to get my copy of my book to say I wrote all about this in my book.
Yeah, we'll have that.
I had more or less lived in a library when I was in Paarl. It was either in the library or the cinema, one of the two things. There was no television. So I read voraciously, and I decided, because I didn't want to be a teacher or a journalist, which were the two other options given to me, I decided to become a librarian. So I went to the University of Cape Town to study librarianship. And there I sank without trace. I managed to get to, I can't remember, 6 courses towards a librarianship BA degree. And then I had to leave because my parents couldn't afford to keep me there. Photography was a bit weird. I'd gone through a whole bunch of hobbies when I was young. My parents were always buying me this and buying me that, and then I'd do it for a month and give up. And so they'd actually got seriously pissed off and weren't doing it anymore. And I went on a trip up the coast on a liner with my school, and they gave me the family, family box brownie. And I took pictures, and I just loved that. And when I came back, I said, I want to do this. And they said, no, Dice, it's too damn expensive. When I got to the university, one of the first things I did, I found a very cheap camera in a shop, a chemist shop. And he allowed me to pay it off over 6 months, and I started taking pictures. And they had a darkroom in the university, and I got completely hooked. Yeah, that was the start of my photographic career. And then I met Yvonne, and she needed somebody to take pictures for the column that she wrote for the Cape Times on entertainment. At the end of my first year at university, my father managed to blag a job for me at the Cape Times. He bought a whole lot of printing stuff through his firm, and he sort of more or less blackmailed them in the way they used to do into giving me a job. And I ended up in the Cape Times library in a summer job. The librarian didn't want me, but he had to take me. And on the first day, after lunch, a very clear memory, this woman walked in who was working night shift, so she came in after lunch. And I looked up in utter amazement and thought, oh my God, that's Yvonne Bryceland, the famous actress. In South African terms, she was very well known on radio. And she toured around in what was amateur productions, but for us were really big deal. She came down and came to Paarl in a play in which she directed and played the lead. It was called The Strawberry Blonde, I think, and she had to dye a wonderful red hair blonde. And she I didn't see it, but so I knew who she was. At the end of the day, I sort of went along to the they had filing cabinets, and she was on the other side, and everybody'd gone, and I was incredibly shy in those days. And I sort of went up, and I remember looking over, and all I could see was sort of this much, because these big flyaway glasses she had, Audrey Hepburn glasses, and she was there, and I sort of gulped and said, "Are you the Yvonne Bryceland?" And she was incredibly shy, but said, yes, I'm Yvonne Bryceland. And then we started talking and sort of didn't stop for 30 years. In South Africa, you had 3 radio stations, well, 4. You had the English service, the Afrikaans service, something called Springbok Radio, which was the commercial service, and then for the adventurous amongst you, you had Lorenzo Marx, LM Radio, which was broadcast from outside of the boundaries of South Africa. And they had a lot of really good programs which couldn't be censored, but you didn't really notice censorship. So you literally had 3 stations that you could listen to. You have to think of 2 eras. There was the 1950s and the 1960s. The 1950s, the whole world was locked into the 1950s. South Africa wasn't alone in having some forms of censorship around. It was a very rigid area. And so there was a lot of censorship which didn't seem unusual. Then we hit the 60s and everything exploded. all of the hippie areas, all of the Woodstock areas, all of the, the hair, nakedness on stage, and suddenly things got out of hand. And in South Africa, the censorship rocketed up. You know, when John Lennon said, we're more popular than Jesus Christ, that resulted in their next couple of albums being banned in South Africa. We never saw them out there. It was that kind of thing. So censorship suddenly got much stricter in the 60s. Cape Town was a sort of thing for me. I used to, when we traveled into Cape Town, I used to wait for the mountain to appear. Everybody that lives in Cape Town has this thing about Table Mountain. It's sort of a big thing in their lives. And I used to do, and the universities sit on the bottom, and I wanted to go there. So, having arrived there was like bliss, And secondly, you had, about something like 10 major cinemas, and I lived in the cinema. I studied cinema, really, not librarianship.
So, because you mentioned film a lot, and that was a big part of your... So, were films censored? Were you aware?
Yes, films were censored. Films were censored. But yes, you were sort of... when South Pacific came out there, they had a version of South Pacific which was apparently nearly a half an hour shorter than what everybody else even saw, because there's this theme of miscegenation, with the kids of this man that are mixed race. And that just vanished from our version of South Pacific. Came out, people said, we're being deprived of all this extra material. And if you brought the LP, there were songs that you didn't see in the film. So it was a very big thing, censorship, through the 60s. When I got to university, suddenly there was this whole new world for me to explore. And I remember one day, I knew about theatre, but I had never actually seen anything outside of, Moira Lister was a famous South African actress who lived over here, but she came there and she did a program on Dorothy Parker. That was the only real piece of theatre I'd seen outside of the big sort of pantomimes that we'd come and see. So I arrived there, and there was this little theatre called the Hofmeyer. And at the Hofmeyer they had a company which would do 3 or 4 plays a year, and sort of semi-professional, financed by a man called Leonard Schach. And they had a play running, so I thought I'll go and see this play. And I bought my cheap seats because I didn't have much money, but they had these seats right up in the back, which were actually called the love seats because they were 2 seats put together. So you could sit and cuddle if you wanted to. And I sat there all on my own at a matinee. And this play just utterly blew me away. It was the first time that I ever discovered that sort of tunnel vision that goes with something amazing. And the play was Harold Pinter's The Caretaker, and the person that gave me that tunnel vision was Nigel Hawthorne. He was a young actor working out there, and he has that lobotomy speech, and I just went away, and I came out of it a complete convert to theatre. And then I started looking out, but there wasn't a lot of theatre in Cape Town. But then I came up against Yvonne and started following the things she did, which were at the University of Cape Town, drama school. They had a whole bunch of actors who in any other thing would have been professional, Percy Seif being one of them, Yvonne being another. There were a whole lot of really good actors doing that. And that's when I started seeing theatre on a different level. Yvonne was completely the catalyst for everything in my life then. I mean, she changed my life around completely. From a very small town, very naive young boy. Suddenly here I was with this woman who was 16 years older than I was, had 3 children, a divorcee, completely, for an entire year and 3 months, I lived under the illusion that she was a platonic friend. This great platonic friend, because, at that stage I had American films that told me that you married somebody who was 3 years, younger than you and a virgin. And here I was with somebody 16 years older and with 3 kids, so she wasn't a virgin. It was a huge, my whole world in that sense was wonderfully, I think of it as turned the right side up. you know, and she introduced me to a mass of things, and through her I started taking pictures professionally. So she had this absolutely, you know, changed my life completely. Well, you know, I went from my small hometown Paarl, in which, for instance, I had no idea what something called a homosexual was. What we had was something we were told about, and they were they were called bunny boys. Why, I still don't know. And apparently you had to be very careful about them on trains. And that I still don't understand either. However, I suddenly come into Yvonne, and two best friends are gay. And I'm introduced into a whole situation where I learn about homosexuality and gayness. I learn about black-white relationships. And she was writing for Drum. She had all these friends, you know, the one night, you know, I knew that she was trying to keep me away from something. I just, you know, I wasn't invited, and I was getting used to being invited. And finally, I just, you know, said, you know, okay, what's happening? Why are you cutting me out? So she finally said, okay, look, come around tonight. So I went around. The whole family was there, all very excited. And suddenly in walks this guy who's about 6'4" tall, followed by his, I think, 6'5" brother. And both of them looking like they stepped out of a bloody Hollywood movie. And they're Malay South Africans. They're cricketers, and I know who they are because the year before, when Basil D'Oliveira left for London he's actually become an international cricketer, which he couldn't in South Africa, I went to a match which was played to collect money for him, and these two had played in there. They were fantastic cricketers and amazing looking guys, and I got really jealous of them. And afterwards I said to Yvonne, I don't understand, because they were, what they were doing, they had their 16mm projector, and they were coming to play films, which the family looked forward to enormously. And we had a great evening, and Tiny Abed, he's a lovely, lovely man. And later after that, Yvonne and I were, you know, I said, I don't understand why you kept me away, because I was thinking, is she having an affair with this guy? And she said, oh, sorry, you know, you come from Paarl, and I really wasn't sure how you would respond to, you know, a Malay guy in here. And that hadn't even occurred to me. Because I thought, is she, you know, in love with this guy? You know, that was it. And that was the beginning. And then we gave up on that. And then I started working with her. I used to help her type out her columns. And she ghosted a column for a young society coloured person in South Africa. She would go to all the parties, and then she'd come around to Yvonne, tell her everything, and then Yvonne would write this as though she was talking. And then we'd deliver it to Drum magazine. I used to sit on my little motor scooter outside in District 6 thinking, oh God, somebody's going to mug me here, while Yvonne went in to drop off a copy, you know. And then we got, you know, we went to all kinds of places in District 6. There was the Nas restaurant, amazing place, where I sat as this little boy from Paarl amongst all this mixed group. Cape Town was very mild in relation to that in South Africa. You know, things happened there that didn't happen anywhere else. There was the Lakshorama Cinema, which was also a theatre, which had mixed audiences. You know, there was the Little Theatre, the University of Cape Town's Little Theatre, which also played to mixed audiences, because they actually had mixed casts as well, because they could. It was a very strange area with a lot of mixing over, so you didn't notice the harshness of apartheid. Where I did notice the harshness of apartheid was when I was doing my military service, and I ended up in a place called Potchefstroom, which is the hell and gone up the other end of South Africa, and in an area which is hugely, radically nationalist. And I went to a rugby match there, and I was horrified to watch how people treated the black people who were selling stuff around there. I remember looking at that and thinking, this is appalling, you know, and I'd never seen that where I came from. What you've got to understand is that in 1948, the nationalists took over power. And so over the next 15 years, they slowly started changing laws. Up to that stage, universities, especially Cape Town University, was open to whoever came. So blacks and whites could go to it. And then suddenly, they started changing this. They had to change the constitution, they had to do all kinds of things, and that took time. And so, frankly, right through until the 70s, you were still allowed, if you were black or coloured, to go to Cape Town University. Right from early on, I'd go to parties with Yvonne, and we'd see all kinds of amazing people because she knew everybody. It was a small society. However, then I started doing ballet photography, and started knowing who the ballet dancers were, and we were going to other parties. And then Athol came into our lives, and suddenly we were in another group of party area. And as I say, these things started almost, when we talked about a creative soup, they just started getting together. So our friends would come to his friends, and Athol particularly had a group of people as his friends who were called die zestigers, which means the 60s people. They were artists, writers, poets, painters, sculptors, who were actually they were mostly Afrikaans, and they were very much against the whole system. They were very radical in that area. So there were a lot of those parties. And then Yvonne joined Capab, the Cape Performing Arts Board, and the actors started joining in. So we also had the directors, etc. And so you were at parties quite frequently with people from all over the place. It was rather wonderful because it wasn't just theatre people, it wasn't just that. You had, a dancer in this corner talking to a painter who then went on to talk to a poet who then went on to talk to a director. Yeah, it was just an extraordinary time, and that was where it came in. And then when Athol came in and started working, a lot of actors started coming in, and then the parties in our terms, started getting closer around theatre, and that's when people started saying, I wish we had a space to work in. So and that I heard over and over again until, when I came to London and actually sat in the open space, thought, oh, maybe it's possible. People don't, I'm sitting in London, there are theatres here, but there should be many more. People just don't think it's possible. And I didn't think it was, I never thought of starting a theatre, and it was only because of Orestes and its effect on my life that I sort of thought, well, let me get a slightly bigger photographic studio, so that people can do theatre in that. I never thought of starting a theatre which would run full-time. We had this enormous happening in South Africa, where this man placed a bomb on Johannesburg railway station, which killed this old lady and badly damaged the little girl. And that was a really big event. Nothing like that had happened. And it was around the time of all of the trials at Rivonia, Sharpeville, all of those kind of things had been happening. It was a real ferment in South Africa. And John Harris, who was caught as the man who'd done that, and he was tried and he was hanged. Athol's response to that was, he was affected by the society, the injustice in the society. Can we call him mad? For what he did, and he tied that up with R.D. Lang, who was the big psychiatrist that everybody was reading about at that stage. And so the whole thing came out of that, There was a huge unease all around South Africa on that, There were a lot of people fighting against that. When I was at university, we had a whole group of people headed by a man called Adrian Leftwich. It was a very fascinating area, and they were going around blowing up pylons all over the place, and they finally got caught. and they were a very idealistic group who were frankly rather impractical. But that was happening at that university in Cape Town. But up in Johannesburg, all kinds of things were happening. It was not a sort of monolithic, all white supported apartheid thing. There was a lot of people against it. There was the black sash, the women's thing, that was an enormous effect on South Africa, with a lot of women who would just come out because they weren't allowed to protest in any way, so they'd just come out and stand with a black sash around them, in various places to show that. So there was a lot happening. I met Athol in 1967. He came to Cape Town. Well, I'd seen him earlier. In 1963, I was just starting to take Yvonne out. I'd sort of realized that this was not a platonic friendship, and I took her out to see Athol Fugard in Bloodknot, in the Bloodknot. It was playing in a synagogue, not in a synagogue, it was playing in the hall next to the synagogue in Cape Town, because they couldn't play in any of the other theatres. And we went to see it on a boiling hot summer night, and as we sat down in this full house to see this play, the producer stepped through the curtain and said, "Sorry folks, we've had a power cut. And so we've only got 2 lights, I think it was, to light this, so there will be no lighting effects." Well, Athol never was big on lighting effects in any case, so we sat there, and it's a long play, and I have to say it felt like about 20 minutes. And then it was over, and that was it. I was in love with Athol, Yvonne, all of us were just overawed. In 1967, he came back to Cape Town, this time with Hello and Goodbye, which he was doing with an actress called Molly Seftel, and it was directed by Barney Simon. And we went to see that. And Yvonne arranged to interview him for her column. I probably must have taken the pictures for it, but rather disgracefully, I can't remember. And I met him then at the same time. And that was the first time I'd come up against him. His version of Johnny was amazing in Hello and Goodbye. He was just amazing. And then he and Barney were starting to think of setting up something in Johannesburg in which they would do Athol's plays. And so they flew down to Cape Town to interview Yvonne, saying, would she be prepared to? And she did. She said yes. She was very excited by that, because she was getting really, really disillusioned with Capab. And so, well, that story I think I've told already. But what happened was she went into Capab and resigned and said, I'm heading off. And it was not going to be easy, because, they didn't have money. And Capab asked to see people are living there, the play that they were going to do. And because they had no politics in, said, we'll do it. Which meant that they were all going to get paid properly, etc. And it was arranged that they would also tour to the Johannesburg version of the Cape Performing Arts Board, which is called PACT, the Performing Arts Council of the Transvaal, and they were going to go and do it up there. So that was the first big thing, and they only gave it a short run, and it sold out on the first day. 3-week run, sold out in the first morning. When I sat in the Bloodknot, when I came out, it was a really odd feeling. I thought it was the first time that I'd actually heard a voice that was mine. And that's really weird, because it's not about white South Africans. But I suddenly thought, this is somebody talking about me. Because white South Africans, especially English-speaking white South Africans, had a rather weird thing. We didn't have a history, we didn't have a background. The Afrikaners were rooted in South Africa, they had nowhere else to go. My 2 grandfathers came from Britain. My grandmother came from Sweden, and so I was 2nd generation South African, and I was English speaking. So I thought for a long time that Britain was my home. England was my home. My whole childhood was filled with English things, English radio, English books, everything was England. I was quite shocked when I came here and found that you lot didn't want me, actually. When I was at those parties, there was no idea in my head about that, about it germinating. Well, let me rephrase that. Maybe it was germinating, but I wasn't aware of it. I was aware of a whole bunch of actors and directors sitting around saying, we wish we had a theatre. And then it was when I came to London and sat in the open space and counted at 16 lights up there and sat on these planks of wood which had rubber bound on them, still the most comfortable theatre seats I've ever sat in, and thought, oh, this couldn't cost much. And that was the germination thing in London here, when I suddenly, and what had happened is that I'd seen Orestes, and Orestes just made a whole sea change in my life. Living with Orestes, I was in Orestes for about 3 days of rehearsals at different times. And it was amazing, you know, at that stage, in that area, as far as I'm concerned, I have never worked with a greater director than Athol was then. I mean, he could just do things that I've never seen anybody able to do with actors. You know, you understand he never at any stage won an award as the best director. All his actors won awards, he never got the award, but he's still, you know, the actors wouldn't have got it without him. And so you're sitting in there and you're working your way through all of this stuff, and frankly, I didn't understand it terribly well. I sort of roughly knew what was happening, but it was actually in performance as it started, because when you were actually sitting not photographing, and sitting and this thing was hitting you, and it was unbelievably powerful and mysterious, and it took time for it to work through my system. I didn't come out of it after the first time like Saul on the road to Damascus thinking, aha, this is what happened. It just took time. But one of the major things that started coming to me out of that was, if something has got to be done, do it. Don't sit and wait for somebody else. Don't expect other people. If something's got to be done, and you know it's got to be done, do it. And that was what Orestes brought to me, was that thing, you know. You just have to do it yourself. I was attempting to come to London and couldn't really afford that. And fortunately for me, the magazine I worked for in South Africa, Fair Lady, said, if you're going to London, Bunty Turner, who writes a column for us, is going to London, why don't the two of you do an article on fringe theatre? And that's how I ended up going around London. I saw like masses of plays, 53 plays in the 3 months that I was here, which was extraordinary, an amazingly fertile time, watching some really bad theatre and some amazing theatre. I'll never forget this. On the very first day that I came into the centre of London to meet Bunty Turner to go and interview somebody, I came out of Piccadilly Circus Station. It was a really, really hot July day. And as I came up, there were these two guys there. They were both just dressed in their pants. And the one guy was splattered on the ground, sitting like a baby with his legs back. And the other guy was feeding him an ice cream, but unable to actually hit his face, and he kept splotting it all over. And then the two of them had this long and really passionate and frankly rather disgusting kiss. And I stood looking at this thinking, I can't believe I'm in London. You know, drugs, hippies, all of this. Now, I have to say, subsequently, I have never seen anything like that in London. But that was my very first impression. If I'd have gone back to South Africa and never come back, that would have been it. And then we went on, you know, we went to the Roundhouse. Well, when you went into the Roundhouse in those days, you had to be careful not to breathe too deeply for too long, or you ended up very high. It was an amazing, wonderful place with, you know, Camden Lock in the days when it really was amazing, you know. And so I was wandering around, and on top of it all, I actually came home one day to Yvonne and she said, you look a bit depressed. And I said, if I see another pasty, naked body on stage, I'm just leaving. Because everybody was taking their clothes off, and frankly, they didn't look happy and they didn't look nice. You know, they had bad lighting and you saw pimples and bumps, and it was really horrible. But I kept seeing this everywhere, you know. I didn't see Oh Calcutta, thank God, but I saw a whole bunch. I saw hair, but a lot of the fringe stuff was really in your face, you know, and that's what we were concentrating on. For many years, traveling backwards and forwards to London and back to South Africa, I got searched every single time I went back into South Africa because I had long hair. And you know, the one time I actually bought a banned book, which was Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint. And it's one of the funniest books I've ever read. But it was banned, and I wanted to get it back in. So I was traveling with this rather prissy-looking journalist, and I gave it to her, and she walked straight through, and they searched me top to bottom, you know, every time. But coming to London at that stage, I was not the only one. You know, Hair had just opened the year before. I mean, London was blown wide open. Everybody, this freedom, this sense of amazing freedom that was everywhere was extraordinary. You know, in London, in those days, you had a choice of 20 to 25 lunch hour plays happening in pubs all over the bloody place. You know, there was the most extraordinary amount of theatre going on. And film, you know, I saw 7 films in one day on one thing, you know, 7 films. Went in at about 4:30, staggered out at quarter to 4 the following morning. 3 different cinemas that I'd been to seeing. The films, in that 7-film day, the last couple of films consisted of films by Bergman, but I'm sitting in the cinema, I'm seeing 7 films on the trot through the day, and somewhere in the region of 2 in the morning, suddenly this film comes on, and it's called Battle of Algiers, and it's a sort of an acted documentary on what happened in Algeria between the French and the Algerians. And it just, I was, at the end, I was in tears. I was sitting there really, I was crying, and because it meant something to me that I knew that it didn't mean to the rest of the audience, because it spoke to me about South Africa. And that was happening to me all the time while I was in London, is finding these things that I hadn't had access to in Cape Town were just pinging in and out of me, you know, and changing me all the time. And then sitting in the middle of that and thinking, we should start a theatre and do our own work. The first time around, I didn't really pay attention to that because I was here and I had all of this stuff coming my way. So I didn't really think much of South Africa. Then I went back, we started the space, and the next time I came I was so tired that I didn't really have time to think anything. But in 1976, I was here when the riots started in South Africa. And unlike South Africans who were not seeing it on their television set, I was. And that was an utterly extraordinary experience, just watching South Africa explode, not implode, you know, just the things that were happening. And then going back to South Africa and finding that people were saying, yeah, so what's such a big deal? It was really odd. Even people inside the space hadn't realized how big it was. And I learnt a process of humanities that the closer you are to something awful, the more sort of slightly in denial you become about it. Those riots took everybody by surprise. You know, I don't know whether there was much commentary on it. You know, we were just having these pictures, you know, of Hector Peterson being carried, the little dead boy, you know, being carried. You know, all of these explosions, fires, etc. It was just non-stop. And it happened towards the end of my time, so I didn't see, you know, then I went back and suddenly you're back in a theatre in a land where the television is not showing it, where the news broadcasts aren't speaking about that. It was really odd just suddenly travelling from this uncensored area to the censored area. When I brought the idea up with Athol and Yvonne, they looked at me like a sort of child that they loved and sort of agreed and said, oh, that's really nice, because they never thought it would get beyond that. And when I got back to Cape Town and I started putting into practice, and Yvonne started seeing with horror that I actually meant to do it and that it was going to happen, she wasn't all that happy, because she knew I was heading into, a world of pain as to what was happening there. And then poor old Athol sort of more or less got dragged in unwillingly by the socks. I don't think they ever for 1 second thought it would happen. In late November, early December, and we were opening in January. We'd found the place, and we were taking it over in January. We were going to start build. We had people collecting money, and Yvonne was sitting there, obviously thinking, "Oh my God, he's going to end up with egg all over his face if there's nothing in there." And she started talking to Athol, and I'd said to her, "Let's do people a living there, because it was very successful, didn't have a long run." And Athol said, "No, won't do that." And I was really disappointed, and then he came back a week later, phoned her and said, "Okay, I'll write a play." And bang. At that stage, it was sort of a little bit like Houston, we have liftoff. The minute his name came into it with a new play, the whole place. We had a lot of people already in support, but suddenly it just took off. Part of the problem for me in actually doing this documentary, as you can see, it's and it's not just me. You've seen with other interviews, you just get so emotional, because that area was so rich. It was so rich in memories being created, in amazing things happening, in people doing extraordinary things. I've spoken about, the woman who donated 100 Rand, which was a lot of money, but she did it in 10 segments of 10 Rand because she didn't have any money. The guy that came in and looked around, and we just showed him around, he didn't say anything, and went into the dressing room, and we said, "This is the dressing room," and there was running water but no hot water, and like 3 days later some guys arrived and said, "Where do we put this?" And it was a water cylinder, a hot water cylinder, which he just donated. As far as I know, we never saw him again. But all kinds of things, people just flooded in the doors, and that was where you started finding the people like B. Berman and all of the others just arrived. A lot of them with totally impractical ideas, which they thought that we would realize for them. That was where I realized that ideas are incredibly cheap. Give me a subject, I can give you 10 ideas immediately, all of which will be great and will work. It's realizations that are the real test. You've got to be able to realize your idea, and that I learned from the space. We had hundreds of ideas coming in. Everybody wanted somebody to tell their story. To tell you the truth, I don't remember how I was feeling at that time. Things were happening so bloody fast. I just wanted to be a photographer. I wanted to have the studio in which they could do 2 or 3 plays a year. And every time I looked around, we had a bigger building with a bigger thing. And it was very exciting, walking around with Maciek Maszewski looking for buildings, with him designing a new theatre overnight. He designed 3 different theatres before we got to where we were. It was just a ball. It's like kids playing with, I think that's what it felt like. It's what several people have said. What was it like being at this space? Well, it was a game. It was fun. It was exhilarating constantly. It was very tiring. It burned people out in the long run, but it was real fun. I was completely aware of what they were doing. Yvonne had talked, and Yvonne wrote 3 of the speeches herself, and I'd been there when she'd come home swearing and cursing about Athol pushing her into this corner, out of which she had to come with a new speech, and she wrote speeches for the play, and and then he was just a genius at doing that with actors. So I knew entirely what it was about, because he told me the story. Myself and Yvonne went off with him and Sheila and our kids, and we went to this lovely place in Neisner, which was a holiday area. We spent, I think it was 2-3 days there, and Athol just talked about possibilities. It was the first time I'd heard about the island, the first time statements, and Sizwe Banzi. All three of them were ideas that he had said were in his head. So I knew he'd chosen that. What I didn't know was the title. So it was when we started setting up the space, we knew that it couldn't be a non-racial theatre. I mean, it was against the law. We knew that. But we didn't want to just cave into the law. So the decision was taken quite early on that what we would do is let anybody in that wanted to come in, and that the government, we thought, would then immediately come and stop us. The police would arrive and say it, and they would give us a piece of paper, which, you know, the plan was to blow up to door size and have it plastered on the front saying, "We are really sorry. You know, if you are not white, you can't come into the theatre," and then underneath, "But you can join the Space Club," and we were going to be doing all our productions probably to the Space Club. That was the plan. The fact that nobody ever stopped us, or, you know, only once or twice were those efforts made, was not in our thoughts. We just never thought it would happen. And as I've said before, over time, I've realized that they were probably using us as a guinea pig. You know, saying, yes, you see, it can happen. Because what most people constantly ignore is that there was a very large ferment amongst Afrikaners, especially in the business sector, who were saying, this system can't last. It's damaging us commercially. We can't keep it going. We're spending too much money on defense. We can't keep it going. We have to change. And that was already in process. It wasn't because of the space. It was already there. I knew it was there. I'd spoken to people who were talking about that. And so they probably just thought, oh, well, let's see what happens. I didn't think it would last beyond the first couple of days. I mean, you know, when I took the posters out, I walked up and down Long Street, which was a daily thing of mine. I'd lived in Long Street for years as a photographer. I knew all of the business people. I went into them one after the other, said, could I put up this poster? They all said, yes, put it up. I went and put it up in their windows, went to have tea at Studford's, came back up the street, and all but one of them had taken the poster down. And I thought, oh, yes, we are in trouble here. Donald got his own story in his interview. Donald arrived in South Africa. I'm not conscious of meeting him in London. I might have, but I know he met Athol and Yvonne at the Royal Court. And then he decided to come out to South Africa, and he just pitched up at the space one day. And, you know, Yvonne said hello, and we took him for lunch and supper and stuff, and then started talking. He was a playwright, and then he was talking about this version of Othello that he'd written without Othello, and we said, hooray, come and do it here. And that was how Donald got involved, you know. And he did that, and it was very successful, not hugely monetarily, but it covered its cost. And he then stayed on, and he did, you know, a version of a thing called Enemies, which was a compilation of various anti-war plays, which was gigantically successful. And then he did Scarborough, his own play, which got banned. Our first real clash with the censors was Donald Howarth's Scarborough. And it was a little bit unexpected. Mainly because we almost hid it. It was happening in our little upstairs theatre, which was just a big bare space. We'd done Gilgamesh there, and Donald took these three actors and went up there to do this play, which involved nudity and male, female, and male, sort of not blatantly, but sex. And so we always knew it was going to be a problem, but we were only playing it really in theory for our club. We were doing it very laxly at that stage. We hadn't, you know, nobody'd come and knocked on our door and said you shouldn't be doing that. So we didn't worry. But, you know, there's a whole part of me that was really happy when it was banned, because Donald utterly insisted on reality, and he had about 25 bales of real hay up there, and he had Naked Flame. Not only naked bodies, but naked flame. And I got so paranoid about that I was in every night, and we got two stage managers, and we were sitting on different sides of the thing with fire extinguishers. I had a hell of an argument with Donald saying, you can't do that because we can't fireproof it. No, nothing will happen. On the first night, Jackie Singer, somebody had not checked the little gas burner, and Jackie went and lit this, and whoosh, this flame came out. And she had this pot of water that was going to go on top of it, and she started to pour the water, and from the front row, Victor Holloway, who was the critic of Die Burger, the Afrikaans morning, he was a Marxist working on this nationalist newspaper, and he was sitting there, and I was right opposite him, and I just heard him say, no. And Jackie took it away, and then she took a knife and she sort of clacked at this circular thing at the top, and the flame went out. And my heart had stopped. I'm amazed I'm alive. So frankly, when they banned it, I was thinking, oh, thank God for that, because I thought we were going to incinerate about 35 people every night. It's a real shock when the censor board comes in for the first time. I sort of got used to it later, but you know, this man arrives, and it's always a man, and he arrives with a sheet of paper and says, sorry, you know, this play has got to stop, and gives it to you, and you ask a couple of questions like, can we go a few more nights? No, it stops now. And then, you know, on this is the ridiculous reasons that they give for banning a play. Well, in those cases, you know, nudity, you know, sex, in South African terms, quite, you know, believable. But, you know, we hadn't expected any of them to come to what was a very small happening. You know, as I say, we could only take in, I think, 30 people a night, sitting in 2 rows on either side of it. I knew certain players. I hadn't seen them, but we used to go up and spend holidays in Schoenmakerskop, where Athol lived. There was a little bungalow, we used to go and live there. It was lovely, it was great. And one particular year, Yvonne had been made honorary member of certain players, which was a huge, huge honor, because there were only 3 whites involved. Can't remember, the lady next door lived to Athol, was a lovely sweet little lady, and she was the treasurer, and Athol obviously, and Yvonne. And on one night we were up there, and Yvonne said, it's the annual general meeting of certain players, you can't come. So I had to stay at home. She said, you can come along at about 10 when we're breaking, we'll have tea. So I went along at 10 and walked into this room full of actors, black actors sitting there, and it's an experience I'm not going to forget easily, because one of them looked at me, and with this look in his eyes which told me that if I dropped dead and had an amazing heart attack there, he would just have gone back to drinking his drink. You know, he just didn't rate me as anything. It was real hatred, you know, in his eyes. And I'm talking about a hatred which wasn't directed at me, it was directed at my white skin. You know, I don't care about you. That was Winston and Chawner. And so I had that meeting with them, you know, and met all of them. Some of them were really lovely and very friendly and things, but, you know, there was this thing, and they were amazing. And, you know, Athol had talked about them, all of the plays they'd done, The Coat, Friday's Bread on Monday, all the various things, their version of Antigone. There's a whole bunch of things that were regular. In those periods of time, we used to visit with Athol, and on those holidays, every night we'd go around. Athol would set up his kierum board, you know, it's Malay sort of snooker, billiards. It's a little flat board with little flat pucks, and you play it like billiards. It's an amazing game, and he used to set it up, and the 2 of us would play. Yvonne was bored out of her skull by this, but he'd keep talking as he went, and he's a fantastic raconteur, and you just heard him, all of these stories of what he'd done with serpent players and all that. I just drank it in, you know. It was amazing to be in that area listening to this man. And that was where a lot of the stuff. So I knew certain players really well. And when we started the space, while he was in Cape Town with us, I can't remember whether it was him suggesting it or whether I asked, I can't remember now. the opening was sort of like this maelstrom. It was like being caught in this giant whirlpool. You know, you hardly had time to breathe and to think nothing, you know. And somewhere along the line, either he said to me or I said to him, why don't you come down with certain players? Because they had just done a thing which they called the terrorists, or the terrorist, but it was their version of a KMU play called The Just. And said, you know, we've got this club, why don't you come down and do it on an Easter day, where they could travel on the one day, do the play on the Sunday night, and then travel back on the Monday, so that they wouldn't lose out on work. And so that was arranged quite early on, and that was the start of everything in terms of that, because, you know, our club went mad for them, because they were an amazing group of actors. I mean, they'd worked with Athol for about 6 years. And they were incredible, and he was incredible. It was a fantastic group of actors. Not just John and Winston, there were a lot of others, just really good actors. And out of that came Sizwe Banzi's Dead, when two of them decided they wanted to become professionals. Certain players came and they did the terrorists with us. They then went back. Athol phoned and he said, John and Winston are really turned on by this. Is there a possibility that they could turn professional? And so I said to him, well, how much would they need? You know, and he told me what their salary was in the jobs they were in. And we started, this started a dialogue between myself in Cape Town and various other groups, music and drama in Durban, MADS, and in Johannesburg, Phoenix Players, and The Window in East London. And all of us thought, you know, if you can take them for X and they can take, and we give them all the money from that, then they'll be able to earn that. And that's how it started. So I went back to Athol and said, you know, this we could do. And, you know, do you want to try that? And that was Sizwe Banzi. So we gave him a Sunday night date in September in 1972, and off he went for that. In the time that I'd spent, myself and Yvonne, with Athol and his family, and he told us all these stories, there was the story of this photograph that he had of a man with a pipe in one hand and a cigarette in the other hand, which were taken by a township photographer. And I'd seen it in his thing. He loved that picture. And he said he wanted to do a play based around that. And so that was it. Now, but he didn't start off doing that play. He started off with something else. They rehearsed for I don't know how long, because they were doing it evenings and weekends. And then the lady who was there, the treasurers, in her garage, they were rehearsing. And one day he phoned me, and this was 2 weeks before they were due to come, and said, I'm sorry, we don't have a play. Okay, we've got a full house. And he said, well, I'm going in tomorrow and I'm taking that picture of the man with it. And that was 2 weeks before they started. And 2 weeks later, they arrived and they did Sizwe Banzi's Dead. Sizwe Banzi is about a man who is being sent back to his homeland, to where he came from, because he doesn't have a pass. In those days, if you were black in South Africa, you had to have a pass wherever you went. And that pass said you're allowed to be in this area or that area, and you couldn't wander out of those areas, because if the police picked you up, you got taken in. Athol had started off working in the magistrates' court in Johannesburg, and this was part of what really, in that sense, sort of radicalized him even further than he was, because he was in this thing where they would bring these people in and they didn't have passes, and it was a huge money-making thing. They would just be guilty, you know, he'd do with 300 people a day, guilty, and they'd have to pay because they hadn't had a pass, and it was an iniquitous system. And what Sizwe Banzi was about was that, about this man coming up against this township entrepreneur who does all kinds of stuff and has got all these ideas, and then one night they find this dead body in this guy that's been stabbed, and he's got a pass on him. And so Styles, the entrepreneur, convinces Sizwe Banzi to take on that identity. So that was what it was about, the length somebody would go to in order to be legally somewhere. The opening night, it was a one-night thing, was by a long way the most exciting opening night I've ever been to, because none of
Right,
us...
sorry, can we do the opening night of Sizwe, just
Okay.
in case it's out of context?
Okay.
Quick.
The opening night of Sizwe Banzi, which was on a Sunday night, and it was the only night of the run, they were doing it once, was easily the most exciting opening I've ever been to. You know, I was expecting nothing because, you know, 2 weeks before he'd said we don't have a play. And then suddenly this thing, and I'd photographed the rehearsal where they were still working on stuff, but you could see it was powerful. And then it just blew the audience away. I mean, you know, I'm speechless, you know, as were a lot of people there. You know, people didn't believe that something that amazing, that powerful had happened in front of them. It was the most incredible piece of theatre with a power that I've never seen equalled. You know, I saw the recent version here in London of Sizwe Banzi and it was lovely, but unfortunately it can't have what that had, you know, where the police could have walked through the door and stopped the whole thing, which they did later. Sizwe Banzi did the one performance with us, and then the local Progressive Party looked at this and they loved it. A lot of their members came. They were in South African terms, the sort of more radical white party, and they said we'd like to run it late, you know, if we as a fundraising thing, and we'll pay them, etc., etc. And so we put them in late night after another play. It started at about 10:30 or for a run, and that went fine. And you know, this is an all-black group, and nobody stopped us. So we made plans to bring them back. We got above ourselves. We said, come back next year, we'll do a full run. So the next year they arrived, we publicized it, we had an opening thing. And on the opening day, I was standing in the box office getting ready, and these two guys walked in and said, this play's going on tonight, it's illegal, you can't do it. Police brought out their stuff. Sorry, if you do this, you will be arrested. And so we had, fortunately for us, really high-powered legal advice that came from people that were called Queen's Counsel or State's Counsel, very high-powered barristers who worked for us. They were amazing men. And they came back and said, you're right, you know, you can run it as a club, that's legal, but they can arrest all of you for this. So we closed down. We didn't do that night, and we said to everybody, because we had a full house already, when they arrived, because it was that late, we said, sorry, we can't do it. But we're reopening on Thursday. Do you want to rebook as a club member? Because most of the early people were club members. And that was when people like the Space Club was set up to be the legal part of our operation for when, as we thought inevitably, we would be closed down for letting people of colour into the theatre. And that was why it was set up, and we started getting membership quite early, but we, I think, had about 100, 200 people had joined. And it was pottering along, and frankly it wasn't serviced very well. You know, we sort of used it as a publicity thing, but we hadn't been stopped yet. After we'd done the political parties' late night shows of Sizwe Banzi, they went off and they then went up and they toured to various other areas. And it was during that time that they actually did a performance in one of South Africa's Bantustans where they got arrested and thrown in prison. And in London there was this huge march led by all kinds of actors, Janet Sisman and a whole bunch of people marched, and so it was very embarrassing, so they let them out again. And I have a feeling that was why when we finally got to redo that, the police were told to come and see what we were doing. It was stopped on the Tuesday, and we then immediately got people like Jean Naidoo and Arthur Benjamin and Yusuf Wadia, who were with Argo Film Club, that had provided us with a lot of our early members, and they came in and signed up in a week 3,000 members. And we reopened on the Thursday night with Sizwe Banzi and played to full houses for about 3 weeks. But club members. On the first night, that Thursday, police arrived, tried to buy a ticket. I said, sorry, you're not a club member, so you can't come in. And so they took me aside and said, you can't go ahead with this performance. And I said, our legal advice is that we can. And they said, well, no, you can't. Can we speak to the cast? So I had to take them back, and Athol and his two actors were there. took them into the office and we talked, and these two guys said, look, you know, you're going to get arrested if you go ahead. And John and Winston and Athol said to me, you know, you're the management, what do you think? And I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, it's okay, but you're the ones that are going to suffer. So if you want to go ahead and perform, that's fine. Our legal advice says it's legal, so we'll do that. So we did. So they said, more or less, screw you to the two cops, who then came and said, you know, we want to come in and see it. And I said, well, you're not club members. And they more or less said, no, but we're cops and we're going to come in. And I didn't argue. So they went in and they sat and watched the first half. And loved it. You know, they were roaring with laughter. It was very funny, John's initial thing, and then they left, and that was the last we heard of that. The island was different from Sizwe-Banzi. Sizwe-Banzi, throughout its first area, and I have a strong feeling throughout its first years of existence, was improvised every night. There was no script. The script was taken off a set of 8 performances that we tape recorded, and poor B. Berman typed fingers to the bone and gave them to Athol, and that was where the published script came from. But Athol, you know, John and Winston just improvised it every night. Athol was starting to get into a period where he started getting very nervy about the fact that he was not writing plays anymore. You know, the Orestes had been improvised using things, and there weren't many words in it. Statements, you know, Yvonne wrote several of the things, several of the speeches herself. Sizwe-Banzi was entirely improvised around the cast, and when he got to the island, he actually decided that he wanted to write it. The Space Club gave them a grant to cover rehearsal. And then at that stage we knew we couldn't play them to an open thing, so it was done as a run to the Space Club members only. But by this stage, as I say, we'd signed up 3,000 members. It wasn't as successful as Sizwe-Banzi because people came to see it and they expected the sort of ebullience of Sizwe-Banzi. You know, there were lots of laughs. It was very moving, but there were lots of laughs. And suddenly you were confronted with this 20-minute opening sequence, you know, with these two guys with sweat pouring off them, and this was in midwinter in Cape Town, going round and round the stage with pretend wheelbarrows of sand and reenacting this thing that used to happen on the island where this particularly awful warder, who was called Hodosha, which means carrion fly that feeds on shit, had made these. He'd take 2 of the prisoners down to this beach and he'd give them each a wheelbarrow and a spade, and he'd make them dig a hole, put the sand in the wheelbarrow, and then wheel it to the other side where the other person had dug a hole, fill that hole up with their wheelbarrow, then dig all the sand into their wheelbarrow backwards and forwards, all day. And that's what he made them do. And that's what Athol was doing in the first 20 minutes. It was a pure Zen experience. It started off horrific, and then it sort of got boring, and then it transferred into another area where you ended up in a complete rage about what was happening. When they arrived in London, they cut it down to 10 minutes. It didn't have the same effect. And so you were confronted by this piece of theatre, which wasn't theatre. Athol was doing stuff, I've never seen anything like that on a stage before or since. And so, but out came this amazingly powerful piece, which was really deeply emotional. There were some laughs in it, but not many. And it just told you everything that you needed to know about being incarcerated as Nelson Mandela was on the island. When they arrived with this play, Athol said, you know, the name is The Island, but we can't call it The Island because that's illegal. We're not allowed to do plays about that. I don't know about being able to see thing, but he had his own little office right at the top, and he may have been able to see over Cape Town out of that. It probably is, you know, I don't know. I don't remember even going to look there. But then they arrived with this play, and it was called Die Hodosha Span, the team of Hodosha. Hodosha being the awful warder who was named after a carrion fly. And that's what it played in Cape Town because we couldn't call it the island. And it's only when it came to Britain that they changed it to the original name. The space really didn't give you terribly much time to think. And, you know, now I have to say, you know, when I hear people talking about it, and this has happened to other people that I've spoken to who were there, you didn't realize in some senses you were creating history because you were too damn busy doing it. So you didn't sit there and think, what we're doing here is, we were just doing that. You know, we were too busy getting it up. We were too busy wondering whether the police were going to come in and close us down. We were too busy about getting the next play up. You know, while it was running, there was another play going. You know, there was lunch hours going. There was children's theatre going. The space did not give you time to think. People worked at the space because they believed in the space. They didn't work there for money because we didn't have that. And that created a very special kind of atmosphere. It was an atmosphere in which artists, being what artists are, people fought, people were jealous. People, you know, there were a lot of people who were very jealous of the fact that when Athol came in to do his plays, it was sort of like, you know, God's arrived and now we do everything that God wants us to do. You know, and some people resented that slightly, but everybody was completely behind what was happening. And, you know, and when you saw the plays on stage, nobody argued with that. You know, yet people went in to see the island and staggered out and just knew that they were doing the right thing. And it was very inspirational for a lot of people to see this amazing theatre being done. But again, you know, as I say, we were busy looking at what the hell is the next play going to be now. It had to survive. It didn't have a subsidy. You know, the Space Club tried to collect about 10% of our annual outgoing to try and help, and in certain areas helped us to build it and rebuild it. But, you know, we had to earn off the box office, and if that failed, we were screwed. I remember one day, quite early on, the Space Gallery. You know, we had the gallery, and we deliberately had the gallery because we were having a cafe. And our lawyers had said, you've got to be really careful of the cafe because you can't have a mixed-race cafe. But you can have a cafe that's attached to a gallery. So they buy their stuff at the counter, and then they wander into the gallery. So we very specifically built it with this council, and then this an architect called Les Brouwer designed this thing, which was a little bit like a gallery with seats in. We put posters and stuff up so it looked like that. And I remember walking to that very early on, and this couple were sitting at lunchtime. It was a white guy and I think an Indian woman, and they were sitting in there, and they were very obviously in love. And they were sitting eating. And I remember thinking, you know, that's what it's about, is actually people like that can come. So we were a refuge for people like that. It wasn't, we hadn't set it up to be, but that was what has happened. We became a refuge for people who couldn't bear what was happening outside the front door. People who were trapped inside areas which they could only act upon when they were inside our doors. And that had its own drawbacks. You know, Jean Naidu, many years later, actually came in one day and said, I'm leaving the space now. I'm not going to be coming in every day, because she was a regular helping out on all kinds of things, because it's getting, for me, it's too comfortable. I'm almost losing contact with the fact that there's a really horrible, vicious system out there that we've got to work on. And I know that we work on it here, but, you know, she lasted about a month and then she was back, you know, but it was that kind of thing. It provided a refuge for a lot of people. And that was something that, you know, I never even thought of when we started. The Space commissioned Sizwe Banzi, The Island, and Statements. You know, we did it. Unfortunately for us, we were naive country people, and they ended up going to the Royal Court because they knew that they would subsequently, if they said that they were the first people to stage them, and they would earn all the royalties. They would earn, I think it's 1% of the 10%. So the Royal Court did really, really well out of our plays, and we got nothing out of them. But all of the plays were commissioned for the space and staged first at the space. The whole Royal Court thing happened because Sizwe Banzi was the first one to be invited to the Royal Court, and we came over, and it was hugely exciting. And it was there that I discovered that, you know, the Royal Court now owned the rights to it to a certain extent. But it was hugely exciting, and then out of that came the thought of the season with Statements and the Island, which was again hugely exciting, and I don't regret it for a minute in those areas. I just wish they'd have been a little bit more honest with us. But, you know, and then out of that first run of Sizwe Banzi came the South African season. And, you know, we came over again. You know, it was amazing. You know, it was just lovely to be here and have that sort of recognition, even though the recognition came in about 6-point type in the back of the program along with a cigarette thanks, you know, to... Right from the early days, when they were asked to do Boesman and Lena in London, Athol was leading the way with all of us in thinking, what the hell is a British audience going to do with Boesman and Lena? And it responded, and it taught me a thing about theatre, and it's called universality. There's some plays that will play anywhere, and they will say, well, not the same thing. They will say something to the new audience. Will look at that and think, oh, yes, I know about that. And so that happened with all of them. You know, Sizwe Banzi at its heart is about dignity, the dignity of a human being. You know, Statements is a play about love and that love denied. You know, and the Island is about that incarceration again and of inhumanity, and you know that happens all over the planet. And so, but in the early days, we all thought these plays will fail in London. I wasn't alone. You know, Athol thought that. Everybody thought these aren't going to work, and they did. So, hooray! And they went on to become very famous and win masses of awards, and that was fine. Well, it was 1972 we did it, and then 1973 it came to the Royal Court. 1974 we had the South African season. What we had, yeah, in the book on the space that I wrote back then, you know, I counted up. We did 57 productions in I think it was 1973 or 4. You know, we had lunch hours. You know, it was nothing to have a rehearsal in the morning, a lunch hour play, an afternoon performance, a rehearsal in the morning and a puppet show going, lunch hour play, an afternoon children's play, 2 plays in the evening in 2 theatres, and then at least 1 late night. It just was non-stop, and you know, all of us were running to keep up all the time. So it was, you didn't have much time, I've said it before, you didn't have much time to think at the space. Well, it was people everywhere in their own areas, you know, people building their sets, people rehearsing plays, people getting ready for plays, you know, our box office being set up all over the bloody place. You know, when we had the outer space as well, you know, we had 2 different box office areas. I mean, it was non-stop. Well, Lily Hertzberg, who did our puppet theatre thing, once wrote an article about us in one of the local papers, saying you would never believe, you know, that on the day that it's going to open, you walk through and you think this thing can't possibly open tonight, until 5 o'clock when it's complete chaos, and then you walk in at 7:30 and it's all clean and clear and it's going, and you don't know how that happened. I'd go to Stutterford's and have tea, and I'd be up in my darkroom trying desperately hard to keep a photographic career going, and then people would come and ask me questions which I couldn't answer, and just generally trying to keep the place going and keep the peace, because you know, when you've got all that many different people in there all doing their own plays and all thinking their own plays were the most important thing, I think peacemaker was probably one of the better descriptions of what I did. But and I was also being the worst organizer the planet has ever seen. You know, unable to write replies to agents, unable to get anything in advance. Statements opened. About 2 weeks after Statements opened, Yvonne said to me, "What's the next play?" I thought, oh, I haven't thought of that. We didn't know. So I started thinking about it in a hurry because we had, I think it was 3.5 weeks to go to an opening date. And that's when we suddenly rushed into people are living there. And then this thing, and I sort of tend to think of that time as me in a tunnel with these trains coming rushing down at me, like every 5 weeks there was a new train coming heading your way, and you had to make a decision as to what the hell it was, which resulted in some really bad decisions and some utterly inspired ones, because you just had to keep going. We could not be closed. If we closed down for a week, the money would go out and we would have to go, I think. So we constantly had to have new things coming on. When we added the new theatre to it downstairs, it became worse. And you were having to get the rights, having to find the people, having to find the cast. So in those senses, what I was doing was getting packages together, finding a play and then finding the director and the cast that was going to do the play, and then trying to get them together, and then having terrible traumas trying to get rights because a lot of playwrights wouldn't let us do things, and a lot of playwrights were very sympathetic to us. And finally, we had really, close relationships with a lot of long-suffering agents in London. However, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have email. Everything had to be done by snail mail, which went to London, and it took a week for a letter to get to London and a week to get back to us. So it was a real problem constantly, and we were constantly changing tack. We'd have this play and we'd think we're going to do that, and then we'd realize we hadn't heard from the agent, we couldn't do that, we'd have to try another play that we knew we could get the rights to. And it ended us up in some really bad positions. We did Outcry, and we'd done something else, and the playwright, I knew that we'd done Outcry, and then we decided to do Glass Menagerie, and I think Bill Tanner told the story in his thing, where we just went ahead thinking, oh, well, it'll be okay, and I'd written to the agent to say, can we do that? But we hadn't heard back, and then like a week before we started, I can't remember, suddenly we got a phone call from the agent saying, we hear you doing this, how dare you do this play without asking? And they hadn't got the letter yet. And we had a real battle, and finally they let us do it. But man, it was not an easy time. So that was what I was trying to do, and I'm a terrible organizer. So, I did things badly. I still regret some things. It's really difficult to think, what I did in that level. But I know that from when I finally discovered that actually what I am as a teacher, and I started teaching, I started really realizing quite early that I have one real talent, which is to believe in people and to give them a chance to do something. I just believe that you're going to be able to do that, and that's, as I've discovered, really quite a talent, because a lot of people don't go there. So in that I'm unquestionably great. I'm tinged with greatness in my ability to believe in other people, and to a certain extent I've found that that's quite inspirational for people. In that sense, I expect I sort of give the artists I work with unconditional love. And having come from parents that gave me unconditional love, and knowing what that did for me as a person, I think that I do that in my teaching, and in that sense in what happened at the Space. People would come with an idea and I would support them as much as I possibly could. And really that's quite an easy thing to do. It's all about a belief in the possible. You've just got to know that the impossible is possible. Without any real proof, and that's what I've always been rather good at. And as I've said before, at the end of my time there, and the one journalist interviewing me said, why are you giving up now? And I said, because I now know why this theatre is impossible and always has been. I now know every single reason why it shouldn't have worked, but it did. It did because people believed in it. It did because people came to it and said, okay, we'll work. And people came and they worked for nothing, and they worked, just because they believed. And that belief made it possible. And that wasn't me doing that. I created a sort of field in that, but other people sowed seeds in that, and they grew. You know, I just added a bit of water every now and then. There's no single reason why the space finally started grinding to a halt, but there's a whole set of reasons. Number one was the oil crisis. You had all of these things happening separate from each other. The oil crisis arrived and prices rocketed. We couldn't put our prices up, but things were costing us more. Television came to South Africa in, I think, 76 or 77, I can never remember, but you know, that decimated. On Tuesday nights, everybody stayed home to watch Dallas. You know, and they weren't watching us. You know, we couldn't get anyone near the theatre. 1976, riots came and suddenly everybody was terrified. You know, I've spoken about this. The closer you get to something real, the more into denial you go. And people didn't want to go to theatre to see something which said there's terrible things happening out there. And we had to find another way around that. And then all kinds of other areas, you know, we lost valuable people, sort of burnt out and moved on, and we had to try and replace. And so there was a whole complex of problems that slowly just sort of leached the life out of us. There was no one time, you know, no one reason why the space started staggering. What was happening was like being in a boxing ring with punches coming, the oil crisis, 1976 riots, you know, one after the other, the arrival of television. And we had to change what we were doing. So when we moved to the new theatre, and we discovered to our horror very early on that because of the 76 riots, people were really, really chary of going to see real political theatre. We had to find a way around that, which is why we did Lysistrata and set it in South Africa and made it into this fun musical which had very hidden, well, not all that deeply, but hidden various political things that we were working on. But then after that, for instance, we had to start using the main theatre as the theatre which earned money for us. We had a couple of real disasters of plays we believed in, but nobody came to see them. So we started doing plays like Woody Allen's Don't Drink the Water and Play It Again, Sam, to earn money. In order that other areas, we had the gym upstairs where we staged all kinds of things. Bill Tanner's Patty Hearst, we did a whole bunch of plays, several of which got banned up there. And we even converted one big room upstairs to a small theatre which had 20 seats in it, in which we did sort of really off-the-wall plays that people came in and said, we'd like to do this. Jean Naidu did a play with Solly Philander and Ivan Abrams in that little place, and you know, we did other plays. There was a weird playwright called Kopi, where we did this really strange piece of theatre of his. We did a Stephen Polyakloff. We'd been in our original venue from 1972 till 1975, and there was a problem happening because our wonderful landlord Raymond Sebu, who owned the building, had now let us these 2 floors. We actually had the whole building, and we weren't able to pay him the sort of rental that he needed. And we knew that we're going to have to move, and so we started looking around for another place, and then we found this YMCA building, which was controlled by the city council, and we had a very good friend called Joan Canty, who was a councillor, and she finally got it for us at, you know, what's called a peppercorn rent. It was hardly anything. So we knew we had to move, and that was the Space Club collected a whole bunch of funds, and we converted that into this new venue for ourselves. But even that was becoming expensive to run in all kinds of ways. So, but the move was inevitable. There was no way we could have lasted where we had been. We always, from the beginning, wanted to do good theatre. We wanted to do theatre that was tough and had some sort of message. There was times when we weren't doing that, but mostly we did. And so we were choosing plays. You know, The Geese, which came in quite late, was an amazing play, and it seemed to be about us. It's set in 17th century London during the Commonwealth, during Cromwell period, and it's about theatres being shut down, and it's about how a little group tries to stay alive. So it meant something for us. It lasted exactly 2 days and was banned. You know, there were a whole bunch of other things that we were doing these plays, and they'd come in and they'd ban them out from under us. It was incredibly frustrating, especially, for instance, David Rudkin's Ashes, we actually did not understand why they banned it, because there was no apparent political reason to ban it. It turned out to be a very male reason why it was banned, but that's a long story. But so we were having these damn things banned, and it was a real problem, because we had a shutdown. After the Geese, we actually had a week, and we had a director who said he was directing Duchess of Malfi, and that was coming later, and he said, he was from the RSC, and he said, I really can't get it ready. And it was banned on the Thursday. So on the Monday, we opened with our famous play, which was made up of all the titles of all our banned plays. And it was a discussion, it was an examination of ourselves, because we were told by our lawyers that we couldn't criticize the censor board. You were not allowed to criticize them. You could be sent to jail or fined and things. So they said, whatever you do, make sure that there's no direct criticism. So we went the other way. We said, we've been banned, and therefore we know we've done something wrong, and we're trying to understand that. And so what we went out, we got masses of material from advertising, from songs, from everything, which, there was a famous Bob Marley, I think it was Bob Marley's song, which was all about ganja, which was played on the various hit parades, and nobody understood that it was a play about, in South African terms, dacha, marijuana. And that was allowed to play. So what we did is present this whole play, this whole thing, which I had to present myself, my only time on stage, and thank God the last time ever. I realized I do not want to be an actor of any kind. I had to present that as the head of the space. And the lawyers were really clear, you can't get anybody to do it, you have to do it. You've got to say, I'm guilty, I realize we've done bad, but we're looking at all this other material and trying to figure out what it is that we're supposed to be doing. And that had that end sequence, which was just so powerful, when the three actresses who'd been in the Geese came on stage to roars of laughter, and they were dressed in nipple caps and little what they called cash sexes and nothing else, and big feather things on their head, walked on looking, I have to say, really miserable. And the audience, it was very funny, and then each one made a statement about what they'd done in the Geese, and, and how much they'd believed in that. And now they were in this costume of a play that had toured South Africa. It was called Birds of Paradise. It had played to 500,000 people. In the terms that it was only playing to a white audience, that was about nearly 20% of the population had gone to see this appalling piece, which was utterly sexist and survived on having women traveling around in nothing. And these three, and by the end of that, there was no laughter left. Everybody was sitting, including the censor board, who came in on the first night to see what we were going to do, sat in the front row with their little, satchels, their little suitcases with paper on them to make notes as to what the hell they were going to ban, and they couldn't, because there was nothing that we did that could be banned. In 1976 came, we moved, we opened in the new thing. We had Endgame, which had an amazing cast, Bill Curry and Keith Grenville, directed by Dimitri. It was a terrific production. Nobody came. We had another play after that. Nobody came. It was political, and we were sitting thinking, okay, we've just moved and we're going to die. So what are we going to do? And we started talking inside about how and what to do. And I can't remember how this came around, but somewhere along the line, the idea of Lysistrata or Lysistrata, depending how you want to pronounce it, came into ideas. And when I read that, I thought, actually, this is amazing, because if you just divide them along racial lines as well, it starts saying a lot of things. So I gave it to a playwright, a Dermot Judge, and said, would you resettle it in South Africa? And we turned it into a musical, because we thought musicals everybody wants to see. We got this really high-class band, which are really amazing. They wrote the music for it, and we set off on this joyous experience. But it was directed by a woman called Dorian McLaren, and when I sat down to talk to her, I said, because I'd been in Britain and I'd seen the Lenny Bruce story. It was a Dustin Hoffman film. in which this was, and I'd also read a biography of Lenny Bruce, and in that he has this story of him going out onto a stage in, I think, San Francisco, and he stands there and he says straight into the microphone, "Are there any niggers in the house?" And this terrible silence comes. And then he said, "Oh, come on, there got to be some niggers in the house." The house lights come up, and there's this very big black man getting up to go up on the stage and mash Lenny Bruce. And then he says, and I see we've also got a couple of spics over there. And he goes around and he takes every racial stereotype and picks them out one by one in the audience, and then the audience starts to laugh, and they realize, and then he ends up saying, "They're only words. You can allow them to hurt you or you can't." And I said to her, "Can we build this in somewhere?" And so they did. So what they set up was a thing after a hilarious opening where the women do the opening scene, then the men arrive singing the song, marching in. We had this really weird, what do you call it? We had this really weird wardrobe, which had been donated. We'd asked for donations. So actually we could have done the best 50s play ever. But which was pretty useless to us. But amongst other things, we had about 12 tailcoats. God alone knows, we had 12 tailcoats. So the wonderful designer put them all in tailcoats, long johns, and then she gave each one of them a truncheon and 2 hand grenades hanging sort of politely down their fronts, which was very funny. And they marched onto the stage having done this amazing song. The audience thought that it was very funny. And they then split into 2 racial groups and then decided that they had to get together in order to get their women back, because their women were saying, you know, you guys don't get together and we are not coming in. So what they then did was, right at the beginning, this guy says, "I'll talk to them," and he turns and he yells across at the black guys, "Hey, kafir." Now that's the South African equivalent of "hey, nigger." The worst thing, the thing that I said to a black man when I was 5 years old. And that's what he says. And I used to watch it every night. You could see the shock wave going through the audience. I mean, it was just extraordinary. And there was a mixed group, and they were sitting there looking like, "I don't think I want to be here." And there's total silence in the audience. And then the black guys would start to snigger, and then he'd yell, "Hey," and he started, and they'd done an improvisation where they'd said to all the guys, "What are the worst things you can call a black person?" And I think there were 32, and they trotted them all out. And he was flinging them, and the more he flung these across at them, the more they started to laugh. And suddenly, and it's one of my all-time favorite memories in theatre, this thing just went through the audience. The audience started peeing themselves with laughter. It became one of the biggest laughs I've ever seen in a theatre. It had nothing to do with wit. It had nothing to do with comedy. It had a lot to do with relief. And that was the Lenny Bruce effect. You know, look the word in the face, see if I care. When we started, you know, we started not thinking that we weren't allowed to do things. Then we found we were, and then John and Winston came and did their thing, and then we got stopped on that level. So we went back to the club area where Billy Curry and Vince Ibrahim were members, and they did a lot of productions for club members only. And then we started sneaking Billy, because Vince then came to London, but we started sneaking Billy into productions like Superman, where he played behind a mask, and everybody was, but so he was on stage, and another play called the Patrick Pearse Motel, where he actually appeared without a mask, and we were just sort of pushing this boundary constantly. However, then the Baxter Theatre opened in Cape Town, and that was legally allowed to have a non-racial audience, and that sort of opened it up. So suddenly things were starting to change. The market opened in London, the market opened in Johannesburg, and it was also allowed legally because it was in this weird grey area, because in a market they had to allow everybody in. So it was what was called a group areas grey area, you know, where they just allowed that. So it opened in that, and it was allowed. And in fact, things started relaxing everywhere, and we just started using Billy and other people in. Fats Dika came in with her play, which was called The Sacrifice of Creli, which had a black cast, many of whom then became part of our company. And things started going further. 75, 76, as we moved, it really took off. And we were doing a lot of plays. And at that stage, I'd say that, you know, probably at least 60% of the company, we didn't have a permanent company, but the company of actors who worked there were black. You know, we did several of Fat's plays, the first South African, the children's play that she did, all kinds of, you know, different plays were coming in, and we had a lot of people, and a lot of them were living on the premises. You know, we had this huge YMCA building, and the top floor was full of rooms at which, you know, several of the actors and various other people lived. So it became more it became totally non-racial towards the end. And we started non-racial casting, you know. We did Flea in a Ear, the Fado farce, and it was, you know, Billy Curry played the main role, and he was sort of coloured South African, and his wife in the play was a white actress. So, you know, and we were playing games with these various gender and racial stereotypes. It was great fun. Yeah, I've always said the same thing. Theatre is part of a social process of change, done at its highest. And I'm absolutely certain that because we were doing what we did, that allowed the market to do what it did. And to a certain extent, that allowed the Baxter to open. I mean, that would have happened in any case because they actually had legality. But it nonetheless helped other theatres start doing that all around the country. The latter half of the 70s became very depressing. As Athol in an interview somewhere said, it was the darkest days in South Africa. So you'd had the riots, you'd had all the things. You know, we actually did the Lysistrata thing, not so much also for what it did in terms of South Africa and dealing with those huge problems, but because we were having problems inside the company, where there was a sort of racial tension growing, and it actually did wonders in dissolving that and moving on. But we then started trying very hard to find ways. We were very aware of the fact that we didn't have a large black audience because they couldn't get to us. And so we started trying to go to the townships, first with sort of school tours, where we'd put together a couple of plays, one comedy and one sort of serious political thing, which was not, you know, which was a bit hidden, so we could take those out. We did that 2 or 3. We couldn't do this as much as we'd want to because it was expensive in order to go out there, and it took time. But we did do that quite a lot. And then the final big one was when we took Arturo Uy, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Uy by Brecht, which had this extraordinary cast with women playing the lead roles and black and white, and we took that to the townships, and that was amazing. I wish we could have done more, but you know, at that stage money was draining out, and we were having a real tough struggle surviving. Look, there was always a lot of theatre that was happening in townships in various ways. You know, all kinds of township groups were out there working. You didn't necessarily see them. You know, we've talked. Well, I have talked in this thing about the woman of Crossroads who did this lovely little piece of theatre, which restored my faith in theatre. You know, they were doing that on their own. They hadn't asked, they hadn't thought we'll do theatre, they just told their story. So there was a lot of stuff happening which you didn't see, you know, you didn't necessarily see because it was done out in the townships for themselves. And you had groups, a lot of them in Joburg, who were actually going out there and doing that kind of theatre on a sort of a basis which was mostly sort of amateur. But it was amateur because they didn't have money and they weren't paid. You know, their standard was really high. The thoughts about wanting to give up arrived sort of towards the end of the second last year. We were having a really tough battle, and we didn't have money. We were always behind. People would have to wait a week for the salary so that we could earn some money at the box office. It was becoming awful. One day I walked into the theatre. I was going up the stairs, and my favourite lady, Kathy Zeman, who was with us from beginning to end as our cleaner and everybody's mother, was vacuuming the stairs, and she had this nice new little vacuum cleaner. And I said, "Oh, where's that come from?" And she said, "Oh no, I just had another one at home, so I brought this in, you know, just to help out." And it turned out that our vacuum cleaner had conked in, and then somebody whispered in my ear that she'd gone out and bought her own vacuum cleaner. And I felt really bad about that. And then about 3-4 weeks later, Arthur Benjamin was running the place. He was doing all the accounting, he was doing the box office, he was stage managing, doing the lighting, he was doing everything. But one day I sat down with him to talk about, and I said to him, "Okay, you know, tomorrow we can't pay. We don't have the money, and I'll talk to them tonight and say, you know, I'm sorry. Please, could you wait for another week?" Which we were doing really quite frequently. And I can't remember. I couldn't do it that night. I think half the cast just sped out of the place. Anyhow, I came in the following morning and I said, "I didn't manage to do it." "No, no," he said, "it's okay, they've been paid." And I said, "How?" And he said, "Oh, somebody came in and gave us a donation." I said, "Somebody came in and gave, who?" And he said, "No, they want to remain anonymous." So I finally tracked down that Arthur had gone and cashed in a lot of his savings and paid them. And when I found that out, I thought, that's it. You know, I can't have people like this throwing away their life savings to keep something alive, you know, which is failing. I mean, at the end, there were no audiences. People were just not going to theatre anymore. They were scared to come into the city in the middle of town, and it was just appalling. And it was that stage that I phoned Yvonne in London and said, "Yeah, I think we've got to give up. And, you know, I'll give up and come over." And it was really depressing, to say the very least, you know. I mean, it was just an awful time. What Yvonne meant to the space in certain terms, and people like Percy, you know, were that if they hadn't have acted there, we would have died a lot earlier, because when they acted there, people came to see them. You know, they had an audience, which was very unusual in South Africa. So the two of them and one or two others were really central to that. And Yvonne kept going as long as she could, but then she came over to London with our production of Hello and Goodbye, which was part of the Riverside Studios opening area. And while she was there, she was approached by Edward Bond, the playwright, who said that he was interested in her for his play, The Woman, and would she audition for that, because Peter Hall insisted that she audition. So she did, but it was a while away. It was not coming on immediately, and finally he convinced Peter Hall, and she was taken on. And in the meantime, she would have come back to South Africa, except Ross Devenish, who was the film director who directed Boesman and Lena, asked her to be part of a thing that he was doing. He was doing a directing course at the BBC, and asked her if she would stay on and do that with him. So she was away for it was close to 18 months. She'd left South Africa already. The last 18 months she wasn't there. She came back once for a 3-week holiday, and during which time she played a play at lunchtime. So Yvonne wasn't there for a year, and as I say, it wasn't the days of Skype and things like that. We had to write all the time. It was not an easy time, and at one stage, Moira Fine and her husband Izzy took pity on me, and one day came in and said, "Look, you know, you need a rest, and we're paying for you to go to London to spend some time with Yvonne," which was fantastic, you know. And I came over here, and while I was here, she was doing the thing with Ross Devenish, It was the time when I'd heard about Arthur and Kathy, you know, spending their own money to keep us alive. And over here, I actually said to her, look, you know, and to get the timeline right, she hadn't yet been approached by Edward Bond. She was doing this thing with Ross. And I said, if anybody else asks you, stay, and I'll close down. And then I went back to South Africa. And then Edward Bond came along and boom. She stayed, so she was not there for the last 18 months of the space. She was here. Well, Moira's contribution to the space was gigantic, you know, from the beginning when she was part of the fundraising committee to when she took over the club and then built it up into what it was. And then my mother, who'd worked really, really hard, so hard that she got burnt out and finally had a collapse and had to leave the space. And she'd done all the books and suddenly she'd been, in that sense, the administrator. And Moira took that over. She and the club took over the administration, and that's when, you know, Arthur Benjamin came in to help out. So Moira was running the whole thing towards the end much more competently than I could, you know. And her contribution was gigantic, you know, organizing all of these fundraising things that we had on a regular basis to try and get funds to keep us alive. You know, Yvonne knew me really well, and you know, when I arrived in London, she was really concerned because I was a wipeout. And so when I started talking, she was really happy and said, no, you know, we've got to do that. That burnout is really something, and I've spoken to people that I see working that on. I say, be really careful, because when I moved to London at the end of 1979, it took me nearly 4 years to recover. I mean, for 4 years, well, for at least 3 of those 4 years, I was sort of useless to anybody. Trying to recover from 8 unbelievably intense years, wonderful years I don't regret, but it's not an easy one. And I wasn't the only one going through that, you know. No, Yvonne's career was sort of rather odd. She'd do stuff at the space, and then from quite early on, you know, she got invited to come back and do Statements over here. And then Statements was invited to tour, and it went all around the continent, went to Yugoslavia and all kinds of things. And then when she came back from that, we did Dimitos, and then Dimitos came to London, and she did a run in the West End with Dimitos. You know, so this was constant. Then about 2-3 years later, Hello and Goodbye we did, and they got invited. So she was skipping backwards and forwards, London to Cape Town. Every time she came back, we'd put her into something that we'd hope it would earn some money, you know. When it got to the end, I was a sort of strange mix of numbness and bitterness. You know, we'd had people that just vanished off and would do big things elsewhere and not credit that they'd been with us. I mean, really big names. I'd go and see the plays and the space didn't figure in their biographies. It was a very weird area. It was almost as though they were ashamed of us. I don't know what was going on, but that happened several times. And then later on, when we became more fashionable after we'd closed, they changed again, but that was too late. But so I was sort of numb with all the work we'd done, and it wasn't the only one. And I was bitter about some things, not everybody, there were some. So there were several constants throughout the spaces area. I was obviously there beginning to end. Kathy was there beginning to end. She never left. Moira was there beginning to end. She never left. B. Berman was there for almost the entire time, with the exception of a period she spent in London doing a design course at RADA. But for the rest of the time she was there. John Nankin was there for most of that time. What we're talking about here are sort of, in a sense, the workers. On the other sense, the creatives came and went. You know, so, and you know, really that's what you expect, you know. It would have, you know, Jackie Singer held on as long as she possibly could and finally came in and said, you know, I can't anymore, you know, I just can't, I need something else. And off she went, and then came back. a couple of years later did Lysistrata, did a whole, a set of things. So it was a place that was very difficult to work at and stay fresh. I think I've wiped the day that I had to tell everybody out of my mind. I actually can't remember it because I doubt whether I got through it. I don't know. I mean, it was a really bitter period, and the only thing that saved my life back then was the Women of Crossroads. If they hadn't have done their little play, I would have left South Africa with a deep sense of failure. One of the things the space taught me was a thing about cycles. The space actually went through its entire cycle, and it would have needed a major change to take it further, which I didn't know what that needed to be back then. Now I know what it should have been, but too late. But everything else has that cyclical thing, and I started becoming aware of the fact that various pieces of theatre are for very specific times. Brecht's early plays is what they call his leerstukke, the learning pieces where he does The Mother, which is Gorky's play about an old woman who sets up a communist, I think that was for a specific audience at a specific time. And his later plays were for another audience at another time. And I became aware throughout that of how our audience had shifted and changed and how we'd attempted to keep up with them, sort of rather clumsily at times. But it's a difficult thing, and I didn't know enough about it back then to be able to say, aha, now we've got to do this, now we've got to do that. I was blindly stumbling through thinking, oh my God, what's the next play, and will we survive? Yes, it is. I mean, that's the straight answer. Each generation has got to pick up a baton, even if it's not passed on to them. They just have got to do things for themselves. It's become a sort of almost fetish of mine, saying to people I teach, you've got to go out there and do your own plays. You've got to go out there and tell your own stories. Because nobody else is going to do it for you. And if you go out into, the commercial or the established theatre, you're going to be asked to tell stories that you won't be wanting to tell, that you will not be comfortable telling. And I've had that from a lot of ex-students of mine. That they just feel that what they're doing is not relevant to the lives that they're living and their friends are living. So you really have to, that baton thing, I don't know whether it's a passing on. I think each new group have got to find their own baton, pick it up from wherever, make it and run with it. When we left the space, we sort of semi-handed on the baton to the people's space afterwards. And that lasted for about another 3-4 years, with Moira really trying to drive it very hard. But it was almost they were working on a loser because everything had changed. If I was in South Africa now, what I would be concentrating on is trying to get theatres established in the townships where they could do their own theatre and the people could get to, because all the big theatres that are run in South Africa, and frankly just about anywhere, are in areas that the people that need to see it can't get to, can't afford. And that's what should be happening. Now I know that's what should be happening. Then A, I didn't know, and B, it would have been very difficult because we were having real political problems. You actually at times couldn't get into the township because you had to find a way around a police block. What the space achieved, I think you'd get a different answer from probably everybody that worked there. What I know is that a decade, 5, 10, 15 years after we did the statements, after we did Sizwe Banzi, after we did the island, there's no Immorality Act anymore, there's no pass laws anymore, and the island is now a tourist venue. They don't exist. Did our doing those 3 plays, for instance, just those, did that result in them going away? No, it was part of a process of social change. because we did the plays, people got more conscious of the issue, and then other people started doing things about that. And that for me is the central thing in theatre, is you're always looking at things and saying, we've got to draw attention to things that are happening, things that are wrong, and then other people in the society will come look at that and decide we've got to do something about that. And that for me is what theatre does. It sparks change, it helps change, but it's not the only spark. Theatre's never going to stop being important, otherwise people wouldn't keep trying to control it in the way they do, keep trying to deaden it down, because it's got real power. You know, I look at theatre in London now and I'm in despair, you know, because it's run by a particular cabal who control everything, and they produce theatre which is deadly dull and boring and doesn't go anywhere. And when you look around the world, you suddenly find these pockets of things that are coming out of oppressed societies, you know, where suddenly they get up and they say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, we're going to do our own thing. So as a teacher, I keep saying to people, do your own thing, tell your own story all the time. And theatre is essential to society. It's not a choice, it's essential. The arts generally are essential, but theatre for me is more essential than most, because it deals with an issue which is clearly stated and put in front of you, and you say, look, this is what's happening. Do you agree with this or don't you? What is your attitude to this? And you have to make that decision with good theatre. We were at the end of the space. It was in the last year. We'd already decided to close it down. The decision had been made. We were just working our way through towards the end, and I was a mess. And one day I was phoned by a woman who worked for a local women's organization, and she said, have you seen this piece of theatre that's being done by the women of Crossroads? Crossroads was a big squatter camp on the edge of Cape Town, outside of the big locations, as they were called, Langa and Guguletu and those. And it had been built by women who followed their husbands who were working illegally in Cape Town. And they were allowed to work illegally because the industry needed them. And they were paid less because of that, you know, that wonderful way that capitalism has of using people and allowing it to happen. But they didn't want all the mothers and kids following them, which they did, the wives and mothers and kids. And so you had this very big thing called Crossroads. It became an international thing because these women were really tough and they were fighting back. They kept being, they kept having their houses bulldozed, and they kept being, sent back to the Transkei where they'd come from, the various territories. And so we had television cameras out there, we had everything out there. This was ongoing thing. It was going for, I think, more than a year, a couple of years. Anyhow, have you seen this piece of theatre that the women have cried? No, I haven't heard of it. So I started phoning around. And I phoned a woman that I knew she was a drama therapy, and I knew she'd done work in the townships. I said, do you know? She said, no, I've just heard about it now myself. And she phoned me back about 2 days later and said, it's in Crossroads, it's next Thursday, and shall we go? So the two of us got in my car and out we went to Crossroads, and there was this little shanty which had been built they'd got funds from overseas, and it was built as a little community centre. But they weren't doing it there, they were doing it outside on this big bare area. And almost the whole town, women and children, there were no men because they were all away working, came out and they told this glorious, epic poem of their life. It was how they were doing it. It was centered around one woman, this amazing, extraordinary woman. And what had happened was that she had followed her husband, set up a house, built out of these tin shanties. They had there's a book actually you can find on the wallpaper, because they were wallpapered. All these guys worked in various jam factories, cigarette factories, and they would steal the covers and they would wallpaper the houses, and amazing houses, most of them. So they were all done out of that, and they were living there. So the authorities arrived, bulldozed it down, took wife and I think 3 kids, I can't remember, on the train back to the Transkei, or the Ciskei I think it was, which is like 700 miles, 600, 700 miles away. The woman got off the train and walked all the way back to Cape Town like she had initially. She'd walked to Cape Town. Set up with her husband. How she found him, God alone knows. Set up with her husband in another thing. Authorities found it, bulldozed it to the ground, put her on a train with kids all the way back to the Ciskei. She got off the train and walked back to Cape Town. This was the 3rd time she'd done it. Okay, and she was found and put on a train, sent back. So while they were doing this play, she was probably on her way back. I don't know, again. And these women decided, they said, they did this play. And I when I was finished, I said to them, would you come and do it? Would you come and do it in our theatre? Because it's just amazing. And they did, and it was a joyful experience. And then the market asked them to come up there, and Barney Simon did some work with them, and they did that and came back. And I was writing, at this stage, I'd left the space, it was over. And I thought, I've got to find out. I was writing a column for a weird little local monthly magazine, and a theatre column. And so I thought, what I'm going to do is find out. So I went out into the townships, out into the crossroads, and I went to the woman who played the strong middle lady. She was a wonderful lady called Mama Luke. Her name was Alexandria Luke. She was a tough lady. They were all tough, but she was really tough. She played the lead. And I sat down with her, and it's a really extraordinary interview because during it you can actually hear, I recorded them, she was, every now and then you'd hear this shh, shh, shh. And what she was doing every now and then, she'd keep talking and she'd get up answering questions and have to sweep the sand that was blowing in the door out. And she said to me, if I don't keep doing that, end of the day, I've got 3 inches of sand in my house. And then halfway through this interview, she said, sorry, got to go and get water. Come on, you got to help. And I had to go with 2 buckets. Each of the kids had a bucket, and off we went to this standpipe in the middle and stood in a queue with all of these other women standing with their buckets as each one. It was a real social occasion. It was amazing, and then went back to our house. I said to Mama Luke, did you start this whole thing? No. She said, it wasn't me. Who was it? She said, I think it was Mrs. Yanta. So I go off to Mrs. Yanta, interview her. Did you start this? No, she said, I think it was Mirun and Babosi. So I thought, okay, I'm off to Mirun and Babosi. And I go round in a bloody circle, and I ended up, after 13 women, I end up back at Mama Luke. And I go back and I'm writing this article, and the most extraordinary thing happens to me, because I suddenly think, not one of these women had ever been inside a theatre. Not one of these women had ever been inside a cinema. They were people who came from out in the country, from out in the tribal areas. They were not sophisticates. They had chosen, because several of them said, all of these bloody television crews and the things are not doing a damn thing, so we decided to tell our own story. That was where it came from. And they decided to tell their own story. And I sat back there, and this was the big thing for me. I thought, God, I've just been sitting next to, privileged to see, the roots of theatre. These people just decided one day to tell their own story, and they chose theatre. Now, they didn't have time to be what was coming our way, that we were a bunch of middle-class white wankers who'd never done anything for anybody and were dabbling in this useless preoccupation, which I'd started to believe. And here were this bunch of women who had chosen to do a piece of theatre from nowhere. The theatre just grew out of the ground. And I remember thinking, God, if the whole bloody world gets blown up and you have 6 or 7 kids trapped in a a cave underground, they will do theatre. They will start telling their own stories. And that, you know, I ended up thinking, okay, it's okay. I came to London thinking, you know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter about me. It doesn't matter about the space. There are people out there who need to tell their story, and they will, no matter what anybody says. No matter what anybody pays or doesn't pay, no matter about subsidy, no matter about anything like that, people need to tell their story. It's a wonderful moment. You know, you finally come to thinking what theatre is, and I'm over, I don't know, is it a broad church? You know, there's theatre that should be very funny and entertaining. There's theatre that should make you go out feeling wonderful. There's theatre that should educate you. There's theatre of all different kinds. In my life, through Yvonne, through Athol, through people like that, I've chosen to look at theatre, which actually hopefully is part of a whole process. That doesn't mean that other pieces of theatre are not legitimate. Of course they are. But theatre has got a really high purpose in those areas where it needs to constantly keep a beady eye on people with power. To say, you really can't do that. You know, we're going to expose you. And so you have all the Belarus Free Theatre. You have the groups that are coming out of South Africa now. There are quite a few of them. You've got a lot of people, and it's not just there. There's groups in South America, you know, doing theatre which means something to their community. And when you sit in London, it's sometimes difficult to remember that theatre is a community process. You know, you're talking to somebody, you're communicating something directly to somebody, hoping that you will engage in a dialogue and possibly change their mind, give them a new perspective on things. And that's what theatre should do. Theatre will never go away because stories will never go away. I hate being lectured. You know, a lot of the early Brecht that I saw was lecturing me about stuff. It turned out to be really bad productions of them, but it was lecturing me. And then I discovered, for instance, Dario Fo, who does that wonderful thing where he makes you roll around laughing at things which sometimes you wake up, you know, like a week later screaming in the night thinking, oh my God, you know, what was I laughing at? Or why was I laughing at that? And makes you recondition yourself, reconstruct yourself, which really good theatre does. So when I first arrived here, I saw a lot of what was called agitprop theatre. And what it was people who were preaching to the converted. They were preaching to people who already agreed with them. Good theatre should change people who don't agree with you. And that for me is what theatre's about. When Fats stood up in the Barn Theatre in Cape Town and did that Madam Please, it was like electricity in the atmosphere. And she was just a performer connecting to a text and a passion, a real passion in her heart. And it just swept an audience away, an audience that had come for a completely different reason. You know, they'd actually come to see Janet Sussman doing poetry and Yvonne Bryceland and all of that. That's why they'd come, and suddenly this complete unknown to them steps in and her passion just wiped everybody out. And to a certain extent, that was a moment that set the space on the road. If you don't believe in what you're talking about, and if you don't have the passion and the grit to go out there and think, I want people to listen to me, I have to find a way of making them listen, which is what we did with Lysistrata. We knew that our audience didn't want to listen, so we had to find a way of making them listen, and we did. I'm really proud of that production, because we really did. We didn't always do it, but we did with that. And it taught me a huge lesson in the fact that an audience is not there to sit and listen to you lecturing them about the world. It's there for you to provide them with things and the material to make up their own mind about what the world is doing. And Fats was hanging around all the time, and then at a particular stage, a playwright gave us his royalties, said, don't bother to pay me, use it for something out there. And we used it to sponsor Fats. We took her on as a stage manager. the worst stage manager the planet has ever seen. But, you know, we knew that she wasn't going to, we wanted her to learn about theatre, and she wanted to learn. She was working in a butcher shop, and she wanted to learn, and she did. And then she just hung around and started writing these amazing bloody plays. We didn't use her often as a stage manager.